October 24th, 1944, 0632 hours. The Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura stood on the bridge of the Taiwanese heavy cruiser, Maya watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of copper and gold. The air was thick, humid tasting of salt and diesel smoke. Behind him, the entire center force stretched across the horizon, 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers, over 200,000 tons of steel and firepower, moving in perfect formation toward Leyte Gulf, where American invasion forces waited unaware of the destruction bearing down on them. In 90 seconds, 6 American torpedoes would tear Maya apart. The ship would break in half. Admiral Yamashita would go down with his vessel. Kenji would find himself in the water for the second time in 24 hours, clutching his dead friend's dog tags, wondering how everything he believed had been proven so catastrophically wrong. But this wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was mathematics. Pure cold railroad mathematics calculated by a Pennsylvania coal miner's son who had never graduated from the Naval Academy. A man the Annapolis officers called railroad as an insult. A man who was about to prove that a Depression-era railroad engineer's lesson about train timing could destroy an entire Japanese fleet. And 24 years later, in a classroom in Rhode Island, Kenji would shake that man's hand and call him sensei, teacher. 3,000 yards away, Commander Jack Morrison pressed his eye against the periscope of USS Darter. His hands were trembling. Not from fear, from caffeine. He had consumed 7 cups of terrible submarine coffee in the past 34 hours, calculating, recalculating, checking his father's mathematics over and over. The math that said a 9-knot submarine could beat an 18-knot fleet. The math that Academy officers had dismissed during his 1 semester at Annapolis before the Depression forced him out and sent him to work in the coal mines just to keep his family fed. Railroad timing, his father used to say. Trains don't chase each other, Jackie. You set the switches so they meet where they're supposed to. His father was dead now, killed in a Pennsylvania railroad switching yard in 1928 because someone had broken the pattern. Changed the routine. 1 unscheduled train. 1 unexpected switch position. 1 moment of unpredictability that crushed Samuel Morrison beneath 20 tons of rolling steel. But Jack had learned the lesson that day, had learned it in the worst way possible, standing in the switching tower, watching his father die, watching the mathematics of motion turn deadly when patterns collided unexpectedly. Patterns kill you, unless you're the one using them. Morrison checked his calculations one more time. The Japanese fleet was zigzagging, standard anti-submarine procedure. Every 8 minutes, they turned following doctrine with perfect precision. And that precision, that unwavering commitment to doing things exactly as they were taught, was about to get them killed. Because Morrison had mapped the pattern, had timed each turn, had positioned Darter exactly where the lead cruiser would be after its next zigzag. He didn't need to chase them. He just needed to wait, to let them come to him, to be the switch that the train couldn't avoid. His finger hovered over the firing button. Range 2,000 yards. Closing. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 6. 6 torpedoes streaked through the dark water at 46 knots, their wakes white lines of death converging on a target that had no idea what mathematics had just been calculated against it. Kenji was checking his navigation charts when the world exploded. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how this moment came to be, how a railroad engineer's son learned to sink battleships, how a samurai's grandson learned that honor without wisdom leads to death, we need to go back to Pennsylvania, back to 1928, back to the day Patterns killed a good man and taught his son a lesson that would change naval warfare forever. Pennsylvania coal country, November 12, 1928, 3:47 in the afternoon. 18-year-old Jack Morrison sat in the switching tower of the Pennsylvania Railroad yard watching his father work. Samuel Morrison was a master at this. 22 years on the railroad. Never missed a switch. Never missed time to signal. The other engineers called him the clock because his timing was so precise you could set your watch by when trains passed under his control. The 4:15 from Pittsburgh was approaching. 45 miles per hour, right on schedule. The 4:18 from Harrisburg was coming from the opposite direction, 40 miles per hour, also perfectly on time. The 2 trains couldn't see each other. The track curved, buildings blocked their view. But Samuel Morrison knew exactly where both trains would be in 7 minutes. So he set the switches now. Not when he could see them now. See that, Jackie? Your grandfather thought timing was about reflexes, about reacting fast when you see something coming. But real timing is about knowing where something will be before it gets there. It's mathematics, geometry. If you know the speed and the direction and the pattern, you can calculate the position. Then you just prepare. You don't chase trains. You set switches and let them come to you. Young Jack Morrison watched his father's hands move across the controls with practiced confidence. This was art disguised as engineering. Poetry written in steel and steam. What if they change speed, Dad? They won't. Engineers follow the schedule. That's what makes this work. Patterns. Predictability. Every engineer on this line knows the exact speed they're supposed to maintain through this junction. They follow the pattern because the pattern keeps everyone alive. Samuel Morrison checked his pocket watch. A Hamilton 992B, railroad grade. Accurate to within seconds per month. The watch his father had given him. The watch he would give to Jack someday. See this, son? This watch doesn't just tell time. It measures patterns. Every morning I check it against the station clock. Every day, same time. Pattern. That's what the world runs on. Find the pattern, you control the outcome. The 4:15 passed through perfectly. The switch clicked. The track changed. 90 seconds later, the 4:18 came through on the alternate line. Both trains safe. Both on schedule. Pattern executed flawlessly. Jack felt pride watching his father work. This was mastery. This was understanding systems so deeply you could predict outcomes before they happened. His father turned to him, smiled. Someday, Jackie, you're going to use this. Maybe not on railroads. Maybe somewhere else. But you'll remember, timing isn't about speed. It's about position. It's about being where you need to be when you need to be there. Those were the last words Samuel Morrison ever spoke to his son. At 3:46, an unscheduled coal train entered the yard. The dispatcher hadn't logged it. The engineer was running behind schedule from a delay in Altoona trying to make up time. He entered the junction at 52 miles per hour instead of the regulation 40. Samuel Morrison looked up from his logbook, saw the train, knew instantly that it wasn't supposed to be there. The switches were set for the scheduled traffic. The 4:23 passenger train was due in 90 seconds. If the coal train came through on the current switch setting, if the passenger train followed its pattern, they would collide. Samuel ran for the manual override, tried to change the switch position. But the coal train was already too close. The points wouldn't throw. The mechanism jammed. The coal train derailed. 20 cars of anthracite coal at 52 miles per hour hitting a switch set for the wrong track. The locomotive tipped, rolled, crushed the switching tower. Jack Morrison watched his father die from a distance of 30 yards. Watched 20 tons of locomotive and coal obliterate the man who had just taught him about patterns and timing and the importance of predictability. He ran to the wreckage, pulled debris, screamed for his father. But Samuel Morrison was already gone, crushed instantly. The pocket watch had fallen from his hand, landing intact on a pile of coal. The crystal cracked, the hands frozen at 3:47. The pattern had been broken, and the pattern had killed. Jack Morrison picked up his father's watch, held it in hands that would never stop trembling when he thought about that moment. The watch would never work again. The mechanism was fine, but Jack never fixed it, never wound it, let it stay frozen at 3:47 as a reminder. Predictability keeps you alive. Unpredictability kills. But there's another lesson hidden in that truth. If you can predict someone else's pattern, you can use it against them. You can be the unexpected variable. You can be the unscheduled train. The funeral was November 15th. 120 railroad workers attended. The company sent a representative who handed Jack's mother an envelope with $200 and a letter thanking Samuel Morrison for his 22 years of service. Emma Morrison held that letter and that money and looked at her 4 children and knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Jack was the oldest at 18, then Mary 15, Thomas 12, little Sarah 9. Their father's pension would cover rent for maybe 6 months. After that, nothing. Jack Morrison made a decision that night. He'd been accepted to the Naval Academy, appointment from his district congressman, A way out of coal country, a path to becoming an officer, making something of himself. But the appointment didn't come with a stipend, didn't cover the family's expenses, and his mother needed money now. So the next morning, Jack Morrison walked into the Navy recruiting office in Pittsburgh and enlisted. $21 a month, not much. But it was steady, it was guaranteed, and he could send most of it home. The recruiter looked at his paperwork, saw the Naval Academy appointment. You know you're giving up an officer's commission to enlist. You could be commanding ships someday instead of swabbing decks. Jack thought about his mother, about Mary and Thomas and little Sarah, about putting food on the table and keeping the lights on. My family needs the money now, not in 4 years. The recruiter shrugged, stamped the papers. Welcome to the Navy, son. Jack Morrison spent his first 2 years as an enlisted sailor learning the hard way. The physical way, scrubbing decks, standing watch, taking orders from academy graduates who looked down on working-class enlisted men as necessary but inferior. He learned navigation by watching the officers, learned tactics by listening to their conversations, learned leadership by seeing what not to do. But he also learned something else. He learned that most officers followed doctrine, followed the book, followed patterns, just like railroad engineers. And he remembered his father's lesson. Patterns can be predicted. Patterns can be exploited. In 1932, Jack Morrison applied for and received a warrant officer commission. Not the same as being an academy graduate. The Annapolis men made sure he knew that. They called him Railroad. Not because they knew his father's profession, because they thought he was slow, plodding, following tracks instead of thinking freely. Jack didn't correct them. Let them think what they wanted. While they dismissed him, he studied, read every tactical manual in the Navy library, learned mathematics, learned geometry, learned how to calculate intercepts and positions in the mathematics of motion. He met Sarah in 1937. She was a nurse at the Naval Hospital in Norfolk, Irish Catholic girl from Boston. Laughed too loud, drank her coffee black and strong. Reminded him of his mother's strength, his sister Mary's stubbornness. Their first date, he told her about his father, about the switching yard, about the watch. You still carry it, she asked, every day. That's sad, Jack. No, it's a reminder. Patterns keep you safe, but only if everyone follows them. The moment someone breaks the pattern without warning, people die. Sarah understood something about him in that moment. Understood he wasn't just a Navy warrant officer. He was a man trying to make sense of chaos, trying to find order in a world that had shown him how quickly order could collapse. They married in 1938. James Samuel Morrison was born 9 months later, named for Jack's father, a way of keeping the pattern alive, of honoring the man whose death had taught his son how to survive. When Jack held his infant son, he thought about the future, about teaching Jimmy the same lessons Samuel had taught him, about timing and patterns and the mathematics of motion, about being where you need to be when you need to be there. But first he had to survive what was coming. In December 1941, Jack Morrison was a lieutenant junior grade assigned to submarine training in New London, Connecticut. He was at breakfast with Sarah and 3-year-old Jimmy when the radio announced Pearl Harbor. Sarah looked at him with fear in her eyes. Jack looked at his son and thought about patterns being broken, about the unscheduled train that kills. By 1944, Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison had commanded 3 successful war patrols. He'd been promoted twice, transferred to USS Darter as executive officer, then to commanding officer, when the previous skipper was rotated stateside. The crew called him Railroad now, too, but not as an insult, as respect, because Railroad Morrison had a gift for timing, for positioning, for being exactly where the enemy didn't expect him to be. His best friend on Darter was Tom Brennan, the executive officer, Detroit mechanic before the war, enlisted in 1940, rose through the ranks the same way Jack had, through competence and stubbornness in refusing to accept that working-class men couldn't be as good as academy graduates. The two men understood each other, understood what it meant to prove yourself every single day, to be dismissed by men who'd never worked a real job but thought a diploma made them superior. One night, 3 days before the mission to Palawan Passage, Morrison and Brennan sat in the tiny officer's wardroom, drinking terrible submarine coffee, the kind that had been sitting too long, brewed too strong, tasting like diesel and disappointment. You ever think about after the war, Brennan asked. Jack thought about Sarah, about Jimmy, now 6 years old, who'd asked in his last letter when Daddy was coming home to teach him about baseball. Every day. What'll you do? Jack shrugged. Maybe teach. Pass on what I've learned. You fishing boat. San Diego. My own schedule. No more orders. They sat in silence. Both men thinking about futures that depended on surviving, on the patterns holding, on the mathematics working. Morrison pulled out his father's watch, still frozen at 3:47. Brennan had seen it before. Never asked about it until now. Why do you carry that? Jack turned the watch over in his hands, felt the familiar weight, the cracked crystal, the stopped hands, reminder. My dad died because someone broke the pattern, came through at the wrong time, wrong speed. Unpredictable. Ever since then, I've studied patterns, how they work, how they fail, how you can use them, how Jack looked at his XO, trusted him completely. If you can predict someone's pattern, you control them. You don't have to be faster, don't have to be stronger. You just have to know where they'll be before they get there. Then you position yourself. And wait, Brennan understood immediately. This wasn't just philosophy, this was tactics. You've been using this against the Japanese every patrol. I watch how they move, how they react, how they follow their own doctrine. And then I position Darter where their doctrine brings them. Like setting railroad switches. I don't chase trains, I let them come to me. That's brilliant. Or insane. Won't know which until we survive the war. 3 days later, they would know. Meanwhile, 3,000 yards away in a parallel universe of doctrine and discipline, Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura was preparing for the mission that would destroy everything he believed. Kenji came from a different world entirely. His grandfather had been a samurai, real samurai, served the emperor before the Meiji Restoration ended the old ways. The family kept the swords, kept the traditions, kept the belief that discipline and honor mattered more than life itself. Kenji's father had pushed him toward the Navy, modern warfare for a modern age, but still honorable, still serving the emperor, still maintaining the family tradition of duty above all. At Tokyo Imperial University, Kenji studied navigation, graduated top of his class, perfect scores in mathematics, astronomy, oceanography. He understood patterns as well as Morrison did, but Kenji saw patterns as something to perfect, to execute flawlessly, not to exploit. His first assignment was as navigator on the heavy cruiser Atago. Admiral Takeo Yamashita's flagship. It was an honor, a recognition of excellence. Kenji took the position seriously, studied every navigation manual, practiced every procedure, made sure every calculation was perfect. That was the difference between him and Morrison. Morrison studied patterns to break them. Kenji studied patterns to perfect them. In September 1944, Kenji became engaged to Yuki Tanaka, a quiet girl from Kyoto, teacher's daughter, traditional family. The wedding was planned for December after the great victory at Leyte Gulf that would drive the Americans from the Philippines and turn the tide of the war. Yuki had written him a letter. He carried it in his pocket always. In it, she described the wedding kimono her mother was preparing, the shrine ceremony they would have, the traditional foods, the future they would build together in a Japan triumphant. Reading it, Kenji imagined children, a house in Kyoto near his family, teaching his sons about honor and duty and the samurai way adapted for modern times. He imagined peace after victory, Japan supreme in Asia, America defeated and humbled. It was a beautiful dream. In 34 hours, it would explode along with everything else he believed. Kenji's closest friend on Atago was Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka. No relation to Yuki, but Kenji joked they were destined to be brothers anyway. Hiroshi was younger, 22, enthusiastic, always asking questions, sometimes too many questions. 3 days before the mission, Hiroshi found Kenji on the bridge reviewing the zigzag pattern they would use during the approach to Leyte Gulf. Kenji-san, may I ask something? Of course. The zigzag pattern. We've used it for 3 days now. 8 minutes exactly between each turn. Isn't that predictable? Kenji almost laughed. This was the kind of question Academy instructors would dismiss immediately. Hiroshi, even if the Americans knew our pattern, what could they do? We're moving at 18 knots. Their submarines can manage 9 knots submerged. They can't catch us even if they know exactly where we're going. But what if they're ahead of us, whatting impossible? Our reconnaissance planes would have spotted them. American submarines are big, loud, easy to detect. And even if one somehow got ahead of us, our pattern is designed to prevent them from establishing a firing solution. They'd have to calculate our position minutes in advance. No submarine commander is that precise. What Kenji didn't say, what he didn't let himself think, was that deep in his mind, his grandfather's voice whispered warnings. The samurai who trusts his sword too much dies to the peasant with a rock. Overconfidence is the warrior's greatest enemy. But no, that was old thinking, superstition. Modern warfare was about discipline, about following doctrine perfectly, about trusting that superior training and superior will would overcome American industrial advantage. Kenji touched the letter from Yuki, thought about the wedding, about the future, about victory and honor, and all the things he'd been raised to believe were worth dying for. In 34 hours, he'd learned that some things were worth living for instead. Admiral Yamashita called Kenji to the bridge the morning they departed for Leyte Gulf. The old man stood at the window overlooking the fleet assembled in Brunei Bay. 5 battleships including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers, the most powerful surface force Japan had left. This is the final throw of the dice, Lieutenant. If we break through to Leyte Gulf, we can destroy the American invasion, force them to negotiate, save the empire. If we fail, Japan falls. The weight of that statement settled on Kenji like physical pressure. Everything depended on this. Everything. Your navigation will be perfect, yes? Of course, Admiral. I will execute the zigzag pattern exactly as doctrine requires. 8-minute intervals, 30-degree turns, perfect discipline. Yamashita nodded. Good. The Americans are brave but chaotic. They improvise, they violate doctrine. That's their weakness. Our strength is discipline. We will follow the pattern perfectly, and their chaos will fail against our order. Kenji believed it completely, had been taught it since childhood. Japanese discipline versus American chaos. Samurai spirit versus merchant culture. There was no question who would win when will and honor faced mere material advantage. But 3,000 yards away, a railroad engineer's son, who'd learned about patterns the hard way, was calculating something very different. He was calculating that perfect discipline was perfect predictability, that following doctrine was following a pattern. And patterns could be exploited by someone who understood that chaos wasn't weakness. Chaos was improvisation, adaptation, the willingness to throw out the rulebook when the rulebook got you killed. Jack Morrison stood at the periscope of USS Darter on October 23, 1944, watching the Japanese fleet steam through Palawan Passage in perfect formation. 28 ships, maybe more, all following the same zigzag pattern with mechanical precision. He lowered the periscope, looked at Tom Brennan. They're perfect, absolutely perfect. Every 8 minutes they turn exactly 30 degrees, like clockwork, like trains on a schedule. Brennan studied the plot. Can we catch them? Morrison smiled, the kind of smile his father used to have when setting switches for 2 trains approaching from opposite directions. We don't have to catch them, Tom. We just have to be where they're going to be. Railroad timing, position instead of pursuit. This is insane. So was my father standing in a switching tower controlling trains he couldn't see. But the mathematics worked. And it'll work here too. Morrison began calculating. Speed of the fleet, zigzag interval, turn radius, course projection. His father's voice in his head. You don't chase trains, Jackie. You set the switches and let them come to you. He marked a position on the chart, drew lines, calculated timing. We go here. Silent running. All stop, and we wait. In exactly 34 hours, the lead cruiser will turn directly toward us. Range 2,000 yards. Perfect firing position. Brennan stared at the chart, looked at his captain. This wasn't standard doctrine. This was something else entirely. If you're wrong, then thousands of Americans die at Leyte Gulf, and we failed. The weight of that truth hung in the air. Everything depended on Morrison's mathematics, on his father's railroad timing, on a Depression-era lesson about trains and switches and being where you need to be when you need to be there. Morrison gave the order. All ahead slow, course 270, silent running. We're going to position ourselves in their path, and when they zigzag into range, we fire everything. The crew looked at each other. This was different. This was gambling with mathematics. But Railroad Morrison had never been wrong before. His timing was perfect. Always. Darter crept into position. 85 men holding their breath. The submarine went silent. All stopped. Drifting. Waiting. Morrison stood at the plotting table, his father's broken watch in his pocket, calculating and recalculating. The mathematics had to be perfect. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the fleet would pass out of range. Thousands would die. The entire Philippine campaign would collapse. But if the mathematics worked, if the pattern held, if the Japanese followed their doctrine as perfectly as they always did, then a railroad engineer's son would prove that thinking beats strength, that mathematics beats speed, that a slow submarine commanded by a working-class warrant officer could destroy an entire fleet, all because of timing, railroad timing. The question now was whether Jack Morrison's father had taught him well enough, whether the lesson learned in blood and coal dust in a Pennsylvania switching yard in 1928 could sink battleships in the Philippine Sea in 1944. In 34 hours, the world would know. And 3,000 yards away, Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura would learn that perfect discipline without wisdom is just another way to die. October 23rd, 1944, 0230 hours, Palawan Passage. The radar screen glowed green in the darkness of USS Darter's conning tower. Sonarman Chen, a quiet kid from Nebraska who joined the Navy to escape his father's failing farm, stared at the scope like it held the secrets of the universe. Which in a way it did. Multiple contacts, sir. Bearing 045. Range 18,000 yards. Tom Brennan was at Morrison's elbow instantly. The Detroit mechanic had learned to read his captain's face over 3 war patrols. Right now, that face said everything. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. 6 days of empty ocean, 6 days of nothing, and now everything. Morrison moved to the periscope, raised it for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all he allowed himself. Any longer, and the Japanese lookouts might spot the wake. 3 seconds to see what every submariner dreamed of and feared in equal measure. Targets, but not just any targets. 28 ships, maybe more. I can see battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Perfect formation. Heading 050, speed 18 knots. Brennan felt his stomach drop. 18 knots. They'd known it was possible, probable even, but hearing it confirmed was different. USS Darter could manage 9 knots submerged. Maybe 10 for short bursts if they pushed the batteries to dangerous levels. But 18 knots was impossible to catch. Mathematically impossible. Brennan knew submarines. He'd served on 4 boats before Darter. He knew the mathematics of pursuit, knew that when a target was moving twice your speed, you didn't catch it. You just didn't. Skipper, he said carefully, we can shadow and report. That's what doctrine says. Send the contact report to Halsey. Let the carriers handle it. Morrison didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about trains, about his father's watch frozen at 3:47, about switches and timing, and the lesson that had cost Samuel Morrison his life but might save thousands of others. Send the contact report, Morrison said finally. But we're not just shadowing. Brennan stared. Sir, doctrine requires that we maintain contact and report positions, but actual engagement is only authorized if we can achieve favorable firing solutions without compromising intelligence gathering. With the speed differential, we can't possibly get into position for a shot before they pass out of range. I know what doctrine says, Tom. I also know it's wrong. Morrison moved to the plotting table, spread out the charts. His hands were steady now. The caffeine tremors gone. When he was calculating, when he was working the mathematics, everything else disappeared. This was pure. This was what his father had taught him. Chen give me continuous range and bearing updates. Miller, he turned to his navigator, a farm kid from Iowa, with a genius for mathematics, plot their exact course. I need to see the pattern. The crew watched their captain work. They'd seen this before. Railroad Morrison going into what Brennan privately called his switching yard mode. That moment when he stopped being a submarine commander and became something else. A calculator, a predictor, a man who saw patterns where others saw chaos. For 20 minutes, Morrison tracked the fleet, marked their position every 2 minutes, noted the course changes, watched the pattern merge like a photograph developing in chemicals, and then he saw it. They're zigzagging. Standard anti-submarine procedure. But look at the timing. He showed Brennan the plot. Every 8 minutes the fleet turned. Exactly 8 minutes. Not 7, not 9, 8. Precise, mechanical, perfect. Morrison felt something click in his mind. The same feeling his father must have had watching trains approach from opposite directions. The knowledge that if you understood the pattern, you controlled the outcome. Every 8 minutes, he said quietly. Exactly. Like clockwork. Like railroad schedules. Brennan studied the chart, started to see what Morrison saw. They're following doctrine perfectly. Yes, which means they're predictable. And predictability means vulnerability. Morrison traced a line on the chart. His finger followed the projected path of the fleet, then stopped at a specific point. If we position Darter here, and they execute their next zigzag at 0834 hours, the lead cruiser will turn directly toward us. We won't have to chase them. They'll come to us. Brennan looked at the chart, looked at his captain, looked back at the chart. The mathematics worked. The geometry was sound, but it required perfect timing, perfect execution, and absolute faith that the Japanese would follow their pattern exactly. That's brilliant, Brennan said slowly. Or insane. Maybe both. Morrison smiled. The smile his crew had learned meant he was about to do something that violated every standard procedure in the submarine warfare manual. My father died because someone broke the pattern, came through at the wrong time, wrong speed, unpredictable. Ever since then, I've studied patterns. The Japanese follow doctrine perfectly. Bushido demands perfection. Honor demands consistency. They'll follow their pattern because their entire culture tells them that discipline is strength. And you're betting our lives on that. I'm betting on mathematics. Morrison pulled out his father's watch, set it on the plotting table. The cracked crystal caught the red emergency lighting. 3:47. Forever 3:47. Patterns are predictable. The question is whether we're smart enough to use them. Brennan made a decision. He'd followed Morrison through 3 war patrols. Trusted him completely. If railroad said the mathematics worked, the mathematics worked. What are your orders? Skipper Morrison looked at his crew. 85 men, most of them younger than him, farm kids and factory workers and mechanics, working-class boys who'd joined the Navy because there were no jobs back home, who'd volunteered for submarine duty because it paid extra, who trusted their lives to a railroad engineer's son every single day. All ahead slow, course 270, silent running. We're going to position ourselves directly in their path. And when they zigzag into range, we fire everything. The crew exchanged glances. This wasn't standard. This was gambling. But railroad had never been wrong before. Morrison continued. Tom passed the word. Absolute silence, no unnecessary movement, minimum machinery. We're going to be a hole in the water, a gap in the ocean, and we're going to wait. How long? Skipper Morrison checked his calculations. 34 hours, give or take. The crew processed that. 34 hours of sitting dead silent beneath the ocean surface. 34 hours of breathing recycled air that would get progressively more stale, more toxic. 34 hours of not knowing if the mathematics would work or if they'd just taken themselves out of position for no reason. In the torpedo room, 19-year-old Jake Sullivan from Texas checked the fish in tubes 1 through 6. Sullivan was a ranch kid, had never seen the ocean before boot camp, thought submarines were insane. Still thought that. But he trusted Railroad Morrison the way he trusted his father about cattle and weather and all the things that kept a ranch running. His loading partner, a kid from Brooklyn, everyone called Brooklyn, because no one could pronounce his actual Polish name, whispered, "You think this'll work?" Sullivan thought about his promise to himself. When they got back to Australia, he was eating a whole pound of bacon. Real American bacon. Crispy, salty, perfect. The kind his mother used to make Sunday mornings before the ranch started failing and they had to sell off the cattle. Railroad's got this, Sullivan said. He's done crazier. We've never sat still for 34 hours waiting for an entire Japanese fleet to sail into our lap. First time for everything. Brooklyn laughed quietly, nervously. What do you think about before an attack? Sullivan didn't have to think about the answer. Bacon. When we get back to Fremantle, I'm eating a whole pound, maybe 2. If we get back. When? Railroad don't miss. The submarine crept into position. Morrison had calculated the exact coordinates. the spot where the Japanese fleet's zigzag pattern would bring them within 2,000 yards. Point-blank range for a submarine, almost impossible to miss. Darter settled at 70 feet, all machinery secured except minimum life support. The crew took stations and waited. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched. Minutes crawled. Morrison stood at the plotting table. Brennan beside him. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. The mathematics either worked or it didn't. The pattern either held or it didn't. In 34 hours, they'd know. Meanwhile, 3,000 yards away, Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura was executing the zigzag pattern with perfect precision. He stood at the navigation table on Atago's bridge charts spread before him, calculating the next turn. 8 minutes since the last course change. Time to execute the next maneuver. Course change to 080, he announced. 30-degree turn to starboard. The helmsman acknowledged. The massive cruiser began its turn, smooth, precise, exactly as doctrine required. Admiral Yamashita stood at the bridge window watching the fleet move in formation. This was poetry. This was the Japanese way. Perfect discipline, perfect execution. Every ship turning at the exact same moment, every ship maintaining exact station. This was why Japan would win, because Americans could never achieve this level of coordination. Excellent navigation, Lieutenant Yamashita said. Your instructors at Tokyo University would be proud. Kenji felt warm with the praise. This was what he'd trained for, what his family expected, what his entire culture demanded. Perfection through discipline. Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka brought tea to the bridge, found Kenji at the navigation table. Another perfect turn, Kenji-san. As it should be. Hiroshi hesitated, then quietly, "May I ask something?" Kenji nodded. The pattern. We've used the same 8-minute interval for 3 days. If American submarines are in the area, haven't we given them enough time to map our movements? Kenji smiled, patient, the way a teacher smiles at a student who doesn't understand. Hiroshi, even if they mapped our movements perfectly, what could they do? We're moving at 18 knots. American submarines are slow, clumsy. They chase targets. They don't calculate, they react. Our pattern is designed to prevent them from ever establishing a firing solution. But what if one is ahead of us? What if they're not chasing? What if they're waiting? A question touched something deep in Kenji's mind. His grandfather's voice. The samurai who believes he cannot be beaten has already lost. Overconfidence kills more warriors than enemy skill. But Kenji pushed the thought away. That was old superstition. Modern warfare was different. Scientific, mathematical. American submarines were good, but they weren't that good. They couldn't predict movements with such precision that they could position themselves hours in advance along a route they couldn't possibly know. Impossible, Kenji said firmly. Our reconnaissance would have detected them. And even if one somehow evaded detection, the precision required to exploit our pattern is beyond their capability. American submarine commanders are brave but undisciplined. They improvise instead of planning. That's their weakness. What Kenji couldn't know, was that 3,000 yards away, a railroad engineer's son, who'd learned about planning in the hardest way possible, had already calculated exactly where Atago would be in 32 hours, had already positioned his submarine exactly in that spot, was already waiting with the patience of a man who'd watched his father set switches for trains that were miles away. The hours crawled by. In Darter, the air grew thick, stale. The carbon dioxide scrubbers worked overtime. Men breathed shallow, moved slow, conserved oxygen. The temperature climbed, 90 degrees, 95. The hull sweated condensation. Everything was damp. Everything smelled of diesel and sweat and fear and recycled air that had passed through 85 pairs of lungs too many times. Morrison stood at the plotting table. Hadn't moved in 6 hours except to sip terrible submarine coffee that someone kept bringing him. The coffee was cold, bitter, perfect. Tasted like survival. Chen reported positions every 30 minutes. The Japanese fleet was exactly on schedule, exactly following the pattern. Morrison marked each position, drew lines, confirmed his calculations over and over. Brennan brought him a fresh cup of coffee at 0200 hours, watched his captain work. "You ever doubt yourself?" Brennan asked quietly. Morrison looked up, tired eyes, caffeine tremors back, but steady, always steady when it mattered, every second. But doubt doesn't change mathematics. Either the pattern holds or it doesn't. Either I calculated correctly or I didn't. Doubt is just noise. How do you block it out? Morrison touched his father's watch. I remember that doubt didn't save my father. Hesitation didn't help. The math was simple. Wrong train, wrong time, wrong switch position. The outcome was inevitable. So I don't doubt the math. I trust it. At 0800 hours, 26 hours into the wait, a battery casualty alarm sounded. Quiet. But in the silence of the submarine, it might as well have been a siren. The chief engineer appeared at Morrison's elbow. Skipper, we've got a problem. Battery bank 2 is showing irregular discharge. If we don't surface to recharge soon, we might not have enough power for high-speed maneuvering after the attack. Morrison studied the battery readouts. The engineer was right. This was a problem. If they surfaced now, they might be detected. The Japanese had destroyers screening the fleet. Reconnaissance aircraft, surfacing meant risk, but staying submerged with failing batteries meant they might not be able to escape after the attack, might not have the power to run. How long can we hold another 8 hours? Maybe 10. Then we have to surface or we're dead in the water. Morrison calculated. 8 hours. The attack was scheduled for 0834, 26 minutes from now. They could hold. We hold. No surfacing. We'll charge batteries after the attack. Skipper, if we don't make it out, there won't be an after. Then we better make it out. The engineer nodded, went back to nursing the batteries, coaxing every amp out of them, praying they'd hold. At 0820, Chen's voice broke the silence. Contact, multiple screws, bearing 045, range 12,000 yards, closing, speed 18 knots, steady on course. Morrison moved to the periscope, raised it for 3 seconds. The Japanese fleet filled his vision. Massive, powerful, beautiful in a terrible way. Ships that each carried more firepower than Darter had in her entire arsenal. Ships that could crush a submarine without even knowing it was there. He lowered the periscope, looked at Brennan. Time to next zigzag. The navigator checked. 6 minutes, sir, Morrison nodded. This was it. 34 hours of waiting came down to 6 minutes. If the Japanese followed their pattern, if they turned exactly as they'd been turning for 3 days, if the mathematics held, the lead cruiser would turn directly toward Darter's position. If they didn't, if they'd changed the pattern, if some Japanese officer had the same instinct Hiroshi had, then Darter was in the wrong position. The fleet would sail past. Leyte Gulf would be vulnerable home. Thousands would die. Morrison's hands were steady as he gave the orders. Come to periscope depth. Stand by on tubes 1 through 6. The submarine rose, slowly. 50 feet, 45, 40, 30. Morrison raised the periscope again. The lead cruiser was massive. A Takao-class heavy cruiser, 15,000 tons. 8-inch guns, armored, deadly, range 4,000 yards. Too far. Wait. The crew held their breath. Chen listened to his sonar so intently his hands were white on the headphones. Sullivan in the torpedo room had his hand on tube 1 ready to fire on command. Brooklyn whispered prayers in Polish. Range 3,200 yards. Still too far. Brennan watched the clock. The Japanese should turn in 90 seconds. Should, if the pattern held. Morrison's finger hovered over the firing switch. Everything came down to this, to whether a railroad engineer's lesson from 1928 applied to naval warfare in 1944, to whether perfect discipline was perfect predictability, to whether Jack Morrison was as smart as he thought he was. Range 2,800 yards, 60 seconds to predicted turn. Range 2,600 yards, 30 seconds. And then Chen's voice tight with tension. Sir, the formation is, they're turning toward us. Morrison watched through the periscope. The lead cruiser was shifting course, exactly as predicted, exactly as the pattern said it would. The mathematics had worked. His father's lesson had worked. Railroad timing had worked. The cruiser was heading directly toward Darter's position, closing fast, range 2,400 yards. Wait, range 2,200 yards. Wait, range 2,000 yards. Morrison's finger pressed the switch. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo launched. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. 6 torpedoes in 15 seconds. Each one a promise. Each one a precisely calculated death sentence, traveling at 46 knots toward a target that had no idea what mathematics had been done against it. Downscope. Dive to 150 height. Right full rudder. All ahead full. Darter turned and dove. The crew braced. Morrison counted in his head. Torpedo run time at 2,000 yards. 94 seconds. On the bridge of Otago, Kenji Nakamura was checking his calculations for the next turn when the world exploded. The first torpedo struck Otago amidships, directly below the bridge. The blast was beyond sound, beyond comprehension. The ship lurched. Kenji was thrown against the navigation table. His ears rang. Smoke, steam, screaming. Emergency lighting flickered. Admiral Yamashita was shouting orders, but Kenji couldn't hear, couldn't process. The second torpedo hit the bow. The entire forward section crumpled. Water rushing in, the roar like a waterfall inside a cave. Kenji grabbed the railing, tried to stand. The third torpedo struck the stern, then the fourth. The explosions merged into one continuous destruction. Otago was breaking apart. The massive cruiser pride of the fleet was dying. Hiroshi appeared at Kenji's side, face bloody, screaming something Kenji couldn't hear. Abandon ship. We have to abandon ship. Admiral Yamashita stood at his command chair. Calm, accepting, a samurai facing death with honor. I will go down with my ship, the admiral said. You two live. That's an order. Kenji wanted to protest, wanted to stay. Bushido demanded it. Honor demanded it. But Yamashita's eyes said everything. Live. Learn. Tell the story. Kenji and Hiroshi ran for the deck. The ship was listing 40 degrees. Fires everywhere. Men jumping into the water. The ocean burning with oil. They reached the railing. Kenji looked back once. Saw Yamashita on the bridge. Standing straight. Proud. About to die because he'd followed doctrine perfectly. They jumped together. 40 feet down into the burning Philippine Sea. The water was warm. Oily. Choking. Kenji surfaced gasping. Looked for Hiroshi. Found him. They swam away from the ship, away from the suction that would pull them down when Otago sank. Behind them, the cruiser rolled over, broke in half, sank in 8 minutes. The same duration as their zigzag interval. The mathematics of destruction. Kenji treaded water, looked around. Debris, bodies, men screaming, oil fires. The smell of death and diesel and everything he'd believed burning away. A destroyer pulled alongside, through ropes. Kenji grabbed one, was hauled aboard. Collapsed on the deck, vomiting seawater, shaking. A sailor wrapped him in a blanket, handed him something. Kenji looked down. A Hershey chocolate bar, American chocolate, captured from somewhere. The sailor pressed it into his hand. Eat, you need the sugar. Kenji had never seen chocolate in a brown wrapper before. He bit it. The taste was different from the German chocolate he had had once. Sweeter, simpler, somehow warmer. It gave him strength, energy, life. He sat there wrapped in a blanket, eating American chocolate, watching his ship's debris field spread across the ocean, and realized something that shattered his entire worldview. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was calculation. Someone on an American submarine had predicted their movement, had positioned perfectly, had waited, had fired with precision that suggested they'd known exactly where Otago would be before Otago knew itself. Kenji looked at the chocolate wrapper, looked at the water where his ship had been, looked at his hands that were shaking, not from cold, but from the realization that everything he'd been taught might be wrong. The Americans weren't chaotic. They were thinking differently, thinking better, using patterns instead of perfecting them, and that made them more dangerous than any weapon. Where's Hiroshi? Kenji asked the sailor. The man's face said everything. I'm sorry, sir. He didn't surface. Kenji clutched the dog tag someone handed him. Hiroshi Tanaka, 22 years old, his friend, the one who'd asked about predictable patterns, the one who'd seen the danger. The one whose question might have saved the fleet if anyone had listened. Kenji folded the dog tags into his pocket next to Yuki's letter, felt the chocolate dissolving on his tongue, tasted survival, tasted defeat, tasted the first seed of a question that would define the rest of his life. How did they know, meanwhile aboard USS Darter, Morrison was dealing with the consequences of success? The depth charges started 30 seconds after the last torpedo impact. Japanese destroyers converging on their position. Angry, deadly, professional. Boom, boom, boom. Each explosion was a hammer blow, close enough to shake the boat, rattle pipes, not close enough to kill, not yet. Chen listened intently. 6 destroyers, sir. They're setting up a search pattern. Standard doctrine, saturate the area where we dove. Morrison stood at the plotting table, calculating. The destroyers were doing exactly what doctrine said, dropping charges where they'd seen Darter dive, creating a killing field of explosive pressure that would crush a submarine if they guessed right. But Morrison had guessed they'd do exactly that. They're searching where we were, he said to Brennan. Not where we are. More depth charges. Closer. Sir Brennan said carefully, standard doctrine is to go deep. Silent running. Wait them out. Morrison looked at his XO, smiled. That same smile that meant he was about to violate every rule. Standard doctrine is wrong. We're surfacing. The crew stared. Surfacing with destroyers right above them, with charges falling. That was suicide. If we surface, they'll see us, Chen said. Not if we're faster than they expect. Morrison turned to the crew. Listen, submerged we're slow. 9 knots. They're faster. But on the surface running diesels, we can make 20 knots, almost as fast as them. And in all this chaos, smoke debris, other ships they won't expect a submarine to surface and run. They'll keep searching underwater while we sprint away on the surface. This is insane, Brennan said. Morrison grinned. So was positioning ourselves in their path. It worked. Trust me. Brennan made a decision. He'd trusted railroad this far. Blow ballast. Surface. All ahead flank. USS Darter burst from the ocean like a breaching whale. Water cascading off the hull. Diesel engines roaring to life instantly. The submarine wasn't built for beauty, but right now running at 20 knots across the surface while destroyers searched underwater 3 miles away, she was the most beautiful thing the crew had ever seen. Morrison stood in the conning tower. Wind in his face, salt spray, freedom. Behind them, destroyers were still dropping charges on empty water. Ahead, open ocean and escape. Brennan climbed up beside him, shouting over the engine noise. You just violated every submarine doctrine in existence. Morrison laughed, a real laugh. The first time in 36 hours, doctrines for people who can't think. My dad taught me when everyone expects you to zigzag, you zagged when everyone expected you to zig. Same difference, they raced across the water. 20 knots. The destroyers realized their mistake too late. By the time they understood the submarine had surfaced, Darter was 5 miles away and pulling farther. Sullivan stood in the torpedo room, grinning, Brooklyn beside him. Railroad did it again, Sullivan said. 2 tricks in one day, Brooklyn replied. The positioning, then the surface run. The man's either a genius or the luckiest bastard alive. It's not luck, it's railroad timing. The submarine raced toward the horizon. Behind them, a sinking cruiser, a confused destroyer squadron. An admiral who'd gone down with his ship because doctrine was more important than adaptation. And ahead, the rest of the Japanese fleet, still approaching Leyte Gulf, still dangerous, still capable of destroying the invasion. Morrison went below, found Brennan, send a message to Dace, tell Fletcher we're attacking again at dawn, coordinated strike, both submarines, 2 targets. Brennan stared. Again, Skipper, we just barely escaped. Our batteries are half dead. The Japanese know we're here now. They'll be ready. Morrison pulled out his father's watch, looked at the frozen hands. 3:47. That's why we attack at dawn. When they're tired, when visibility is poor, when they think they're safe because they survived the night. We use their pattern against them again. They'll change the pattern. Maybe, Morrison smiled, but they won't change enough, because changing means admitting the pattern was wrong. And admitting that means their entire doctrine was wrong. Pride won't let them. So they'll make small changes, adjustments. But the fundamental pattern will hold. And that's all I need. Brennan shook his head in wonder. You're either the smartest man in the Navy or the craziest. Can't I be both? They laughed, tired, wired on caffeine and adrenaline and the impossible high of having survived the impossible. In 16 hours, they'd attack again. Use railroad timing again. Prove that mathematics beat tradition one more time. And 3,000 yards away, wrapped in a blanket, eating American chocolate, Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura was learning the hardest lesson of his life. That the enemy who'd destroyed his ship wasn't evil, wasn't chaotic, wasn't undisciplined. The enemy was just thinking better. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. October 24th, 1944, 0545 hours, the Philippine Sea. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly. The sky was gray overcast, threatening rain that wouldn't fall. Visibility was poor. Perfect conditions for submarines. Perfect conditions for death. Commander Jack Morrison stood in the conning tower of USS Darter, watching the horizon lighten degree by degree. He'd been awake for 48 hours straight, fueled by terrible submarine coffee and the mathematics that kept running through his mind like trains on predetermined tracks. The Japanese fleet was out there, wounded but still dangerous, still heading toward Leyte Gulf, where thousands of American troops waited, unaware that their survival depended on 2 submarines and the railroad timing of a coal miner's son. Beside Morrison, Tom Brennan looked equally exhausted, equally wired. They'd reloaded all 6 torpedo tubes, charged the batteries just enough to give them maneuvering power, and one more high-speed escape. Everything was ready. Everything except the certainty that the mathematics would work twice. You sure they'll follow the same pattern? Brennan asked quietly. Morrison sipped his coffee. Cold now, bitter. Perfect. They changed the interval from 8 minutes to 7, Admiral's orders after we sank Atago. But they didn't change the fundamental pattern. Still zigzagging. Still predictable. They just adjusted one variable. How do you know? Because changing the entire pattern would mean admitting their doctrine was wrong. And doctrine is sacred to them, so they'll make small adjustments. Tell themselves they've adapted. But the core pattern stays the same. That's the difference between adjustment and adaptation. They're adjusting. We're adapting. 3 miles away on the opposite flank of the Japanese fleet, Commander Wade Fletcher commanded USS Dace. The math teacher turned submarine skipper had coordinated with Morrison via underwater sound signals. Brief coded messages that spelled out a simple plan. Both submarines would attack simultaneously. Morrison would target the new flagship, the cruiser Maya. Fletcher would hit whatever presented itself. Create chaos from 2 directions. Make the Japanese choose which threat to address. And in that moment of hesitation, sink more ships. Fletcher checked his own calculations. Morrison had shared his railroad timing theory during their last port call in Fremantle. Over drinks at the officers' club, the coal miner's son and the math teacher had discussed patterns and predictability and how geometry could beat speed. Fletcher had been skeptical. Math was abstract, war was concrete. But then Morrison had proven it worked, had sunk a flagship using nothing but calculations and patience. Now Fletcher was a believer. He raised his periscope, scanned the gray dawn, found his target, the heavy cruiser Takao running escort position, 15,000 tons, 8-inch guns, crew of 800 men who had no idea that 2 submarines were converging on them using mathematics as a weapon. On board the Maya, Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura stood at the navigation table, trying to focus on the charts in front of him, trying not to think about Hiroshi, about Atago, about the way the ship had broken apart in 8 minutes, the same 8 minutes as their zigzag interval. Mathematical poetry written in death and debris. He'd been transferred to Maya after Atago sank. The new flagship. Admiral Yamashita had survived the sinking, pulled from the water after 3 hours of floating in his life vest, watching debris and bodies drift past. The old warrior was shaken but defiant, refusing to accept that American submarines could be that precise, that intelligent, that deadly. The admiral had called an emergency meeting 12 hours ago. Officers crowded into Maya's wardroom discussing the attack, analyzing what had gone wrong. We were ambushed by a submarine that predicted our zigzag pattern, Yamashita had said, his voice steady despite having lost his flagship. I'm ordering all ships to change the interval. 7 minutes instead of 8. Unpredictable. Kenji had wanted to speak. Wanted to say that changing one variable wasn't enough, that the problem wasn't the interval but the pattern itself, that predictability was the enemy, not any specific timing. But junior officers didn't contradict admirals. Bushido demanded silence, respect, obedience. So Kenji had stayed silent, had executed the new 7-minute pattern perfectly, had watched the fleet continue toward Leyte Gulf with the certainty of men who believed small adjustments equaled safety. Now standing at the navigation table, as gray dawn broke over the ocean, Kenji felt something he'd never experienced before. Doubt, not in his navigation skills, not in his execution, but doubt in the fundamental doctrine he'd been taught since childhood. Doubt that perfect discipline without wisdom was actually strength. Petty Officer Saito Hiroshi's replacement brought tea to the bridge. Young kid, 18. Terrified after yesterday's attack but trying to hide it behind military bearing. Lieutenant Saito whispered, "Do you think they'll attack again?" Kenji looked at the boy, saw himself from before yesterday, confident, certain, believing that Japanese superiority was inevitable. "Yes," Kenji said quietly. "They'll attack again, and we're still following a pattern. But we changed the timing. We adjusted. We didn't adapt. There's a difference." Saito didn't understand. Kenji didn't explain. How could he explain that he'd learned more from defeat than from all his academy training? That the American submarine commander, whoever he was, had taught him that intelligence mattered more than honor, that thinking mattered more than tradition. The 7-minute interval came. Kenji called the course change. Maya turned with the rest of the fleet. Perfect formation, perfect execution, perfectly predictable. Ondarter Morrison watched through the periscope as the Japanese fleet executed their zigzag. He'd been tracking them for 2 hours, had mapped the new 7-minute pattern, had calculated the intercept point with the same precision he'd used yesterday. They changed the interval, but not the geometry, he said to Brennan. Still turning 30 degrees, still maintaining formation. They think 7 minutes instead of 8 makes them safe. Does it? Morrison smiled. Not even close. He'd positioned Darter ahead of the fleet again. Same tactic, same mathematics, but this time targeting the flagship specifically. Maya carried Admiral Yamashita. Killing the admiral twice in 24 hours would do more than sink ships. It would break the Japanese fleet psychologically, would prove that no amount of doctrine could protect them from someone who understood patterns better than they did. Range to Maya, Morrison called. 8,000 yards, the navigator replied. Closing at 18 knots. Estimate firing position in 12 minutes. Morrison checked his watch. His father's watch, still frozen at 3:47. Thought about Samuel Morrison standing in a switching tower controlling trains he couldn't see, trusting mathematics and timing. Thought about the unscheduled train that had killed him. Thought about how that death had taught his son to be the unscheduled variable. The pattern breaker. The switch thrower. Stand by on all tubes, Morrison ordered. This one's for keeps. On days Fletcher had his own target acquired. Takao was moving into position. The geometry was perfect. If both submarines fired simultaneously, the Japanese wouldn't know which direction to evade, wouldn't know which submarine to hunt, would be forced to choose. And in warfare, being forced to choose was already halfway to losing. Fletcher sent a signal to Morrison. Simple. Ready. Morrison acknowledged. 30 seconds to synchronize attack. The submarines rose to periscope depth together. Morrison on one flank, Fletcher on the other. The Japanese fleet sailing between them. Unaware, confident, following doctrine. Morrison counted down. 30 seconds. 20. 10. At 06:32 hours, both submarines fired. Morrison's finger pressed the switch 6 times. Fire 1 through fire 6. 6 torpedoes at Maya from 2,000 yards. Point-blank range. Fletcher fired 4 torpedoes at Takao from 2,500 yards. 10 American torpedoes streaked through the gray dawn water toward targets that had 90 seconds to live. On Maya's bridge, Kenji was marking the navigation log when the lookout screamed. Torpedo wakes, multiple wakes. Starboard beam. Kenji looked up, saw the white lines converging on the ship. 6 of them, coming fast, too close to evade. The mathematics of doom already calculated. He had one thought before impact. They predicted the new pattern too. We changed nothing that mattered. The first torpedo struck Maya amidships. The explosion was massive. Bigger than a Tago, the ship was carrying extra ammunition, fuel, everything exploded at once. Kenji was thrown across the bridge, hit the bulkhead, felt ribs crack. The second torpedo hit the bow, the third the stern. The fourth, fifth, and sixth came within seconds of each other. Maya didn't just break apart, it disintegrated. The explosions were so violent that debris rained down on destroyers 500 yards away. Pieces of the ship, pieces of men, the smell of cordite and burning oil and death. Admiral Yamashita stood at the command chair, blood running down his face from a gash on his forehead. The ship was listing 40 degrees already, sinking faster than Atago. The old warrior knew what was happening, knew he was about to lose his second flagship in 24 hours. Abandon ship, Yamashita ordered calmly. All hands. That is my final command. Officers tried to help him toward the door. He pushed them away. I will not abandon a second ship. A samurai dies with honor. You live. Learn from this. Tell them the Americans are not what we believed. They think differently. Better. Learn from them. Kenji staggered toward the admiral. Wanted to stay. Wanted to honor Bushido. Wanted to do what his grandfather's code demanded. But Yamashita looked at him. Really looked. And in that look, Kenji saw something that changed everything. The admiral wasn't dying for honor. He was dying from shame. From the knowledge that his doctrine had failed. That his belief in Japanese superiority had gotten hundreds of men killed. That being right mattered more than being alive, Liv Yamashita said. That's an order, not a request. Kenji ran, grabbed a life vest, reached the deck as the ship rolled, jumped into the water for the second time in 24 hours. The ocean was warm, oily, familiar now. Kenji surfaced gasping, looked back at Maya. The ship was breaking in half. Fires everywhere. Men jumping, screaming, dying. He swam away from the suction, found a piece of debris, clung to it, watched his second ship in 2 days sink beneath the Philippine Sea, watched Admiral Yamashita go down standing at attention on the bridge. A samurai to the end, honorable, traditional, dead. Kenji floated there holding debris and felt something inside himself break. Not his body, his beliefs, everything he'd been taught, everything his culture had told him was true. It was all wrong. Or not wrong, but incomplete, insufficient, inadequate against an enemy who thought in patterns and mathematics instead of honor and tradition. The Americans had beaten them twice using intelligence, using calculation, using their own doctrine against them. And Japan's response was to stubbornly follow modified versions of the same doctrine, to refuse to adapt, to choose death with honor over life with wisdom. Kenji thought about Hiroshi asking if the pattern was too predictable, thought about how that question had been dismissed, thought about how both of them had survived Atago only for Hiroshi today and Kenji to survive Maya, thought about the randomness of it all, the mathematics that decided who lived and who died based on where you were standing when the torpedo hit. A destroyer pulled alongside. Through ropes, Kenji grabbed one, was hauled aboard, collapsed on the deck, shaking, not from cold, from the fundamental reordering of everything he understood about warfare, about honor, about what it meant to be a warrior. A sailor wrapped him in a blanket, handed him something, another Hershey bar, more American chocolate. This time Kenji didn't wonder where it came from, just ate it, let the sugar flow through him, let it represent something he didn't have words for yet, that the enemy wasn't evil, wasn't dishonorable, was just thinking better. Meanwhile, Fletcher's torpedoes hit Takao. 3 out of 4 found their target. The heavy cruiser didn't sink immediately, but listed severely, taking water crippled beyond repair. 2 destroyers moved to assist. A third cruiser trying to evade the torpedo tracks collided with a destroyer. More chaos, more confusion, more evidence that the Japanese fleet was falling apart under coordinated submarine attack. Morrison watched through the periscope as Maya sank. Felt no joy, no satisfaction, just the grim knowledge that mathematics worked, that his father's lesson was validated, that patterns could be exploited if you were smart enough and patient enough and willing to throw out doctrine when doctrine got you killed. Downscope, Morrison ordered. Dive to 300 feet, all ahead full. They'll be coming for us now. And they were. The Japanese destroyers, furious and humiliated and desperate to kill something, converged on Darter's position. This time they weren't searching blindly. This time they knew exactly where the submarine had fired from. This time they were precise, professional, deadly. The first depth charge detonated 200 yards away. Close, too close. The shock wave hit Darter like a sledgehammer. Light bulbs shattered. Men grabbed railings. Pipes groaned. "They've got us bracketed," Chen reported from sonar. 6 destroyers setting up a kill box. Morrison stood at the plotting table, calculating. The destroyers were doing this right, using proper tactics, coordinating their drops, creating overlapping fields of explosive pressure that would crush Darter if the submarine stayed in the killing zone. More charges. Closer. The boat shook violently. A pipe burst in the engine room, spraying scalding water. Men screamed. The chief engineer scrambled to seal it. Hull integrity compromised, the damage control officer reported. Taking water in compartments 3 and 5. "We need to surface," Morrison shook his head. "No, we go deeper, to 400 feet. Brennan stared. "Skipper, our test depth is 300 feet. At 400, the hull might implode. Might, or the pressure might hold. But if we surface now, they'll definitely kill us. So we go deep. Deeper than they think we can. Deeper than their charges are set for. We hide in the crushing pressure and hope the math holds." "This is insane." Morrison smiled grimly. "You keep saying that, and I keep being right. Take her to 400 feet. Slow descent. Watch the hull stress." Darter descended into darkness, into pressure, into the zone where physics became the enemy as much as the Japanese. The hull groaned, creaked, metal stressed beyond design limits. Men prayed, men cried quietly. Men held their stations because Railroad Morrison held his. At 350 feet, a seam split. Water sprayed in. High pressure. Cutting. The engineering crew scrambled to shore it up. Used wooden wedges, rags, anything to slow the leak. At 380 feet, another seam cracked. More water. The bilge pumps ran continuously, struggling to keep up. At 400 feet, Morrison called, "All stop, silent running, hold this depth." The submarine hung in the crushing darkness. The depth charges continued overhead, but they were set to detonate at 300 feet. At 400 feet, Darter was below the killing zone. The explosions were distant, muffled, like thunder far away. Chen listened to his sonar. Destroyers passing overhead. "Sir, they think we're shallower. They're searching the wrong depth." Morrison allowed himself a breath. The mathematics of pressure, the geometry of depth. His father would have understood. Different variables, same principle. Find where they're not looking. Position yourself in the gap. For 40 minutes, the depth charges continued. Relentless, systematic, professional. The Japanese were doing everything right, except they'd assumed Darter wouldn't go below test depth, wouldn't risk implosion, wouldn't gamble with physics. But Morrison wasn't gambling, he was calculating. The hull was rated for 300 feet with a safety margin. That margin probably extended to 400. Probably. The mathematics said it was safer to risk implosion than guarantee destruction. Gradually, the depth charges stopped. The destroyers had exhausted their racks, had searched every inch of ocean at depths they thought submarines could survive, had found nothing. Chen pulled off his headphones, hands shaking, ears bleeding from the acoustic pressure. "They're leaving, sir. They've given up." Morrison waited another hour. Standard procedure said wait 30 minutes. Morrison doubled it, because standard procedure was what got you killed. Finally, he gave the order. Surface, slow ascent, watch for hull damage. Darter rose through the crushing depths. 350 feet. The hull groaned. 300 feet. Water still leaking, but slower. 200 feet. Daylight filtering down through the water. 100 feet. 50 feet. Surface, the submarine broke into gray daylight. The ocean was empty. The Japanese fleet was gone. The destroyers had searched elsewhere. Darter had survived through mathematics and audacity in a coal miner's son, who'd learned from his father that patterns include the pattern of what people think is possible. Morrison climbed to the conning tower, looked at the empty horizon, felt exhaustion crash over him like a wave. 48 hours awake, 2 attacks, 4 cruisers destroyed or crippled, thousands of Japanese sailors killed, and all because he'd remembered his father's lesson about trains and switches and being where you need to be. Brennan joined him, both men silent, both processing what they'd just survived. That was too close, Brennan said finally. All of it's too close. That's the nature of submarine warfare. You took us to 400 feet. You could have killed us. But I didn't. The math held. You're insane. Morrison smiled, tired, wired, alive. I prefer audacious. Insane sounds reckless. I calculated the risk. They stood in the dawn light, the gray ocean, the empty sky, behind them a debris field where Japanese ships had been. Ahead the long journey back to Fremantle, to Sarah and Jimmy, to bacon and baseball and all the normal things that made life worth preserving. Set course for Australia, Morrison ordered. Time to go home. The news of the attacks reached Admiral Halsey within hours. 2 submarines had destroyed or crippled 4 heavy cruisers, had killed or displaced 2 admirals, had shattered Center Force's confidence before the Battle of Leyte Gulf even began. 3 days later, when Center Force finally reached Samar and encountered American escort carriers, the new commander hesitated, withdrew. Not because the Americans forced him, because he was terrified of submarines he couldn't see, because Morrison's mathematics had created a psychological wound that never healed. That decision saved the American invasion, saved thousands of lives, ensured Japan's defeat in the Philippines, and it all traced back to a railroad engineer's lesson about timing. In November 1944, Morrison and Fletcher returned to Fremantle. 2 weeks of travel, damage repairs, crew exhaustion, but alive. The Navy awarded both men the Navy Cross. Their crews received commendations. The citations read like dry mathematics. Sank 3 cruisers, damaged 4th, exhibited exceptional tactical innovation. But the real story was about patterns and railroad timing and how thinking differently wins wars. Morrison wrote to Sarah, told her he was safe, told her he'd be home soon, told her he wanted to teach Jimmy about baseball, about normal things, about a world where patterns were used to run trains on time instead of sink ships. Meanwhile, Kenji survived, transferred to a 3rd ship, fought through the rest of Leyte Gulf, watched Japan lose, slowly, painfully, predictably. Every battle the same pattern, Japanese following doctrine, Americans adapting, Japan losing. By war's end, Kenji was a different man. The proud samurai descendant who'd believed in Japanese superiority was gone, replaced by someone humbler, wiser, someone who understood that honor without wisdom was suicide. He returned to Kyoto, married Yuki. The wedding was small, quiet, nothing like the celebration they'd planned. But they were alive. That mattered more than tradition. Kenji kept Hiroshi's dog tags, kept the Hershey wrapper from the chocolate that had saved his life, kept the memory of 2 ships sinking in minutes because doctrine was more important than adaptation. And he wondered about the American submarine commander who'd calculated his death so precisely. Wondered who he was, what he looked like, whether he'd survived the war, whether they'd ever meet. In 1955, Kenji joined the new Maritime Self-Defense Force, Japan rebuilding under American guidance, learning American methods, American flexibility, American willingness to question doctrine. Kenji became an instructor, taught navigation, but also taught something else. Taught that patterns were tools, not prisons. That doctrine was guidance, not gospel. That the American submarine commander at Palawan Passage had understood something fundamental. Intelligence beats tradition. Adaptation beats perfection. Thinking beats following. In 1960, Kenji wrote a letter to the U.S. Navy Department, formal, respectful, asking for information about the submarine commander who'd attacked Center Force in October 1944. The commander whose calculations had destroyed Atago and Maya, whose mathematics had taught Kenji more than defeat, had taught him wisdom. The Navy deliberated, consulted records, finally sent a response. Commander Jack Morrison retired, instructor at Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island, and an address. Kenji stared at the letter for 3 days, held it, read it, tried to imagine what he would say. How do you thank someone for teaching you through destruction? How do you honor an enemy who became a teacher, but he knew he had to try? Had to meet the man whose railroad timing had changed his life. Had to understand how he thought, how he saw patterns, how he'd learned to break them. In November 1968, 24 years after Palawan Passage, Kenji traveled to America, to Newport, to a classroom where the past and future would collide, where a railroad engineer's son would meet a samurai's grandson, where two enemies would become something neither expected. Teachers, friends, proof that wisdom transcends warfare, that understanding transcends victory, that the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with the willingness to learn from anyone, even the enemy, who destroyed everything you believed. The stage was set. The mathematics had worked. Now it was time for the reconciliation. The moment when patterns of destruction became patterns of peace. When railroad timing met samurai wisdom. When two men who tried to kill each other learned that survival wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. It's just the